Good evening, everyone. Many thanks to everyone at the National Institute of Social Sciences for bestowing on me such a prestigious fellowship. It really is an honor to be counted amongst such amazing fellow scholars, and to be presenting with them on this stage really is a treat. So I'm here today to present an abridged presentation of my dissertation titled Wielding the Border, a genealogy of U.S. Mexico borderland practices and the purposes they serve from conquest to today. I'm in the heat of battle when it comes to writing this dissertation, so I'm looking forward to presenting some of my preliminary findings with you, and I'm intending to keep it within the allotted time as well. So the theoretical apparatus of this dissertation will aim to account for the function and purpose of the U.S.-Mexico border as a structuring structure as it relates to the formation of the contemporary U.S. states. Because the U.S. is a geopolitical entity, a capitalist state in the throes of rapid decline, a settler colony, and a police carceral state, which is, I know, quite foreboding, this dissertation will draw on literature from the fields of critical border studies, Marxism, post-colonial studies, critical criminology, and political sociology. Within this theoretical framing, the central question will ask, how have bordering practices emerged, and what purposes do they serve? I can expound on practices and purposes a little later, perhaps in the Q&A process, but mostly what I'm going to be focusing on in this dissertation is how does labor, race, state power, how are these forces reproduced at the border, and what are the implications of this process? So I've developed a mixed methods approach to test this theoretical apparatus. Over the past summer, I was in Tucson, Arizona, conducting over 140 hours of participant observations with 2 humanitarian aid groups dropping water along migrant trails at the U.S. Mexico border. These are deadly U.S. Mexico border migrant trails, and this would not have been possible without the generous funding from the National Institute of Sciences, as well as conducting participant observations with an asylum halfway house based in Tucson, Arizona, and conducting participant observations at Operation Streamline style hearings. These are deportation style hearings. I've also planned to conduct 40 interviews with humanitarian organizers, local and federal border enforcement practitioners, and border security industrialists. These are the folks who are basically selling the infrared technologies, the camera equipment, the wall technologies as well. I will also be conducting archival research. Well, I have conducted archival research at the Arizona Historical Society at the University of Arizona, and I have plans to conduct similar archival research in Texas and New Mexico towards the end of this year and the start of next year. So a couple of preliminary findings from my fieldwork. Through archival research at the Arizona Historical Society, I discovered that the rhetorical treatment of indigenous communities during the long 19th century echo the treatment of Mexican and immigrant communities today in the borderlands, with the Apache and other tribes being characterized as roaming bands bent on theft and rapine. These comments are often echoed today with the treatment of borderland communities, particularly immigrant and Mexican communities along the region as well. Early enforcement agencies like the Texas Rangers and the not much known about Arizona Rangers and other such enforcement agencies often contained men who had served in U.S. imperial wars of aggression in the Philippines or in Cuba or in Puerto Rico. Sporadic community-driven violence against Mexican communities through lynching, as well as institutional violence through policing and land dispossession, were co-constitutive. Early law enforcement outfits were deputized to discipline industrial actions on both sides of the border, right? They weren't just law enforcement agencies, but they were also breaking labor strikes. These agencies would develop into federal agencies. It was a local law enforcement agencies developing into federal agencies as the U.S. state centralizes the task of borderland violence and controlling those who are crossing the U.S. Mexico border. So this is where a lot of the funding was put to use, my qualitative research in the borderlands. For my qualitative research, I note that federal enforcement bureaucracies are becoming increasingly sophisticated in their means of preventing migrants from crossing the border. Enforcement practices, which include a physical wall, roving enforcement agents, a digital wall, legal measures to expedite expulsion, and the terrifyingly beautiful, I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but it is a really, really beautiful countryside out in the Sonoran Desert, all collide to create a gauntlet of obstacles for border crossers. From my own ancillary research on deportations in New York City, it is clear that the violence of the border cascades into the interior of the US. However, the U.S. Mexico border is where the violence of the border is most outwardly performative and impactful. Finally, borderline communities have differing relationships with border crossers and federal agencies. So the violence is multivariate, dynamic. People are dying at the border, but there is even a politics of even accounting for those deaths. There is a politics for even resisting those deaths, which I would love to talk about in the Q&A or in the reception upstairs. So just by way of a conclusion, the US-Mexico border is a site for some of the most egregious and harmful practices of the US state. It is serving as a laboratory for dynamic and productive state violence, which in turn folds in on all of us, whether we are citizens or denizens. The aim of this dissertation will be to contribute to the emerging critical scholarship on this phenomena by placing it both within historical context and mapping potential future developments. My colleague mentions climate change. This is probably going to contribute to even more violence at the border as the decades progress. For investigating the historical development and contemporary politics of the US-Mexico border, this dissertation also hopes to place it as a major socio-historical phenomena within the US story of race, capital, and insecurity management. So thank you very much for the funding, assistance, and help. And yeah.